Hello and welcome to Inside the Vault. My name is Sandy Trenholm, and I'm the collection director for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And tonight we are going to have a fun and fascinating discussion about food purity, prohibition, and the election of 1884 with Lisa Andersen, who is our new director of academic strategy. So we're very excited to have you with us here tonight.
Nice to be here.
Yay. And so, as I mentioned before, joining us tonight is Dr. Lisa Andersen. She is our new Director of Academic Strategy. So welcome to Gilder Lehrman team, Lisa. Before that, she was an Associate Professor of Liberal Arts and History at the Juilliard School. So an interesting switch up. Both very, very cool professions. But we've had an amazing time getting to know Lisa and talking about history, research, and primary sources. So Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Let's see, avid gardener, sometimes like my dog, sometimes think he's up to no good, and passionate historian.
Absolutely. I also think my cats are often up to no good, so I get it. All right. And with that, we're going to jump into today's document. So tonight's featured document is a little bit new to our collection. We acquired it in 2018. And one of my responsibilities as a curator is to find new materials and bring them into the collection. So I was really excited to find this one while we were looking for election-related materials. But I really didn't know much about it. So once Lisa joined, and it fits right into her research sweet spot, I thought what a great opportunity for us to learn more about it. So with that, Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you to bring us through tonight's program.
Okay, so indeed, last week, Sandy and I were in the office talking about the 1884 election, because that's what we do as people hanging out in the office, and how the 1884 election was an especially nasty one. Like, it was a really, really difficult one. And I remembered that there was a quote I had from Henry Adams. Do you have that quote? Yeah, so this came to mind immediately. So Adams said, "The public is angry and abusive. Society is torn to pieces. Parties are wrecked from top to bottom. A great political revolution seems impending, yet when I am not angry, I can do nothing but laugh." And I think that there's a certain amount of context we can have here. So Henry Adams is the great-grandson of John Adams. He's the grandson of John Quincy Adams. He's the son of Charles Francis Adams, who had perhaps the most delicate job of the Civil War, which was he was the US ambassador to the UK. And Henry Adams was a wickedly interesting journalist and historian. And so when he says that the 1884 election was bad, that means it's bad, like bad. And there's a lot of reasons for the election's viciousness, and we'll definitely talk about those today. But this is the point at which Sandy showed me that amazing document and how it struck her as very strange, right? Because instead of going to the innumerable issues it could have been, she said, well, I found this pamphlet about the 1884 Democratic Party candidate, Grover Cleveland, and that he was, of all scandalous things, accused of adulterating the food supply. Right? Like, of all things, adulterating the food supply. And the specific accusation here was that Cleveland had, as the governor of New York, vetoed legislation from the state assembly that the writer feels would have been a really, really good idea. But when we take a look at the document cover, we see that it's something really, really fascinating and interesting. So Sandy, can you share a little bit in here with everyone about what stood out to you and why we started talking about this so much?
I can. And I can also say when it first came across my desk, as a possible acquisition, like the first thing that caught my attention was calling Grover Cleveland the chief of adulterators. Mm-hmm. And I'll admit I had to do a double take to make sure it said adulterator. And the skull and crossbones. And as you can see, there's a little bit of what we call bleed through. And that's where the ink on the back of the page is coming through. So it made me wonder what was there. And it turns out it's a skeleton holding a scythe. That's what we say. So I was like, it drew me in, which I'm pretty sure is exactly what the printer wanted you to do, to take a look at this and go, what is happening? And I honestly didn't know a lot about the 1884 election. And that's what drew my attention in first, Lisa. So what can you tell us about it?
Well, and I love that byline in there of anything good enough for the poor, right? And the instructions at the bottom, don't fail to read these pages. Like, there's a lot in there that is in between all the text, something that's meant to be kind of provocative and reads as a little over the top, right? And so that makes it really interesting. So really the question that, Sandy was kind of poking around was this matter of why would people find Cleveland's veto on this legislation, on food adulteration legislation, so scandalous that anyone would think that would make a person change their vote, right? And part of this depends on how much you know about the 1884 election. Okay, so Sandy, get started. What did you know initially when you were looking at this?
Not much. Honestly, I didn't. It's one of those elections that kind of glaze over. Historically, it's not something I've paid attention to. I know it's between Cleveland and Blaine, and honestly, that's about it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that that's pretty representative. Like, part of it is that the presidency itself is getting less important during this era. And that has something to do with it. And of course, part of it is that Sandy knows everything about the Civil War. That is her kind of place where that is her happy historical spot. So I want to elaborate just a little. Okay. So Cleveland is the Democratic candidate, and Blaine is the Republican candidate. So that's the first thing to kind of know. But then you also need to know a little bit about elections during this time and how they operated. So this is an era in which political practices that we would now see as outright intolerable were completely and totally normal. Okay, and I think we have a visual that can help explain that a little bit, right? Yeah, here we go. Okay, so if you look at these ballots, what you notice right off the bat is that each of the two ballots only has candidates for one political party, right? So in other words, you don't have the modern virtue where you get to look at the office and then pick the candidate you'd like. In fact, each of the two ballots only has Republican or only has Democratic candidates on it. And these would be distributed by somebody from the political party to an individual when they were within feet of the polling box, right? So they're right next to the ballot box, and they would get handed this, and then they would get watched as they put it into the ballot box to make sure that they didn't change anything. Right? So part of this is there is no secret ballot, because to have a secret ballot, you need to have the government print it, and that doesn't exist yet. So that's completely and totally exposed. And that's not all that's really wacky about this era of elections. So 95% of newspapers were outright owned or financed by political parties. That's not to say that they had a prejudice for one party or the other, but that the party paid for the newspaper. Fistfights among voters were not at all uncommon. Elections took place in we would think, irregular locations, such as saloons, and they occurred several times a year. So there was kind of a constant cycle of elections going. Most people voted the exact same way for the exact same party in every election. And for most people, that was exactly how their parents had voted. And bribes, or what would have been called voter compensation, when you don't have a secret ballot and somebody says, I'll watch you put this Democratic ticket in the ballot box, and then after you finish that, I will give you money for the missed day of work you had in order to come to the polls and vote. Or I will give you these coupons for beers in this saloon where we are casting our ballots. So we see a lot of this as just outlandish behavior that we would see as incompatible with virtuous democratic governance. But it also explains why voter turnout was generally over 80%, right? So for people who were eligible to vote, and there were a lot of people not eligible to vote, but for people who were, elections were kind of fun. They were rowdy, entertaining sorts of things. So there's a good thing and a bad thing that come out of this. So what Sandy knew when we looked at the original document was that this was a rambunctious kind of political environment. She knew that the document was pro-Blaine, pro-Republican propaganda, and that she had a hunch that it was in the midst of an unusually close election. And I think that that's really important. The other kind of context thing here is that if Democrat Grover Cleveland is to be elected in 1884, that would make him the first Democrat elected to the presidency since the Civil War. So the Democrats had been associated with the Confederacy and with the American South. And so this would, by some people, be seen as bringing on essentially the conditions for a stealthy Confederate retakeover of federal government. So all of that seems incredibly important. What it doesn't do is explain why, with everything that was involved, the movement against Cleveland took the form it did in that pamphlet we were looking at. Why food adulteration? Like that seems just like a very strange sort of topic to hone in on and develop an entire pamphlet about. And for that, you have to know a little bit more about the status of food distribution at this historical moment. And these are some wonderful illustrations from inside the pamphlet itself. And you can again see the bleed through that Sandy was talking about. Sandy, did any of these seem especially interesting or appealing to you? I mean, they're all horrifying, but
they're all pretty horrifying. I have to say, like, I'm a mom, and I have, mom feelings sometimes. And all of these are targeting children, which also, if you go back through history, there's a lot of other things that target children and family in order to get you to think or believe a certain way and vote a certain way. So
absolutely.
Milk. I also thought it was funny that the girls are eating the candy while the boys are eating bread. I don't know if there's anything there. I thought that was interesting.
I've never walked and eaten bread at the same time.
I haven't, but it's also like not the 19th century anymore. So maybe it was more of a thing. And as I said, I had just listened to a podcast on the swill milk scandal of like the 1840s, I think. So
great. Oh yeah, that's good stuff. Okay, so part of this is like food production in the 1880s, right? It's in part of an era in which the key thing is that people don't know the person who made their food, right? That's perhaps the most important thing. So you have some people who are still buying food in bulk, like when they go pick up groceries, they go to a store where there's a barrel of flour, and then they scoop the flour into a container that they bring home. And there's some people who are buying prepackaged branded food at this historical moment. So there are some brands that are being sent in cans or closed containers. So that really depends on where you live and what the market is like where you live. But in both cases, you probably don't know who did the actual making. Now, to the point, like looking at the illustration on the left in particular, the battle to safeguard milk quality had been very, very difficult and was super long lasting. So parents had really good reason to believe that their kids' milk might be dangerous or something totally different than milk. Okay, so dangerous is because nobody was actually checking the health of the cows. And so sometimes the cows had sores and that pus just leached into the milk. This is gross. And sometimes it was because formaldehyde was added as a preservative, which is questionable. And it was particularly something else that it might not be milk because many companies basically, or farmers just skimmed the cream off the top of the milk and then they diluted it with water and then they added chalk to make the milk look white again. And there was a whole ongoing concern about what the heck is margarine, right? That was really a long ongoing process of trying to figure out what it was. Could you tell it's not butter? They seem to be asking. And so there was widespread food fraud during this era. So, for example, there's a new book out by Deborah Bloom called The Poison Squad, and she lists a series of really great examples of things that were common at this time. So honey that was really just colored corn syrup, or vanilla that was booze plus food coloring, or jam that was really made just from peels, or this is the ickiest, flour that included a percentage of stone dust. And so there were some questions here about what exactly was the problem, like what had happened because there was adulterated food in the food supply. And that, I think, is our next image from the pamphlet, right? Oh, no, is it? Oh, no, not yet. Okay, sorry, I misdid that one. Anyway, so the most common reported problems from this era included diarrhea and vomiting, which, that's lovely. But also the milk in particular was blamed for children's joint problems, delayed growth, and in a couple cases, it was linked to a number of deaths. So this is really a problem. And up until the early progressive era, there was absolutely nothing to prevent this, other than buyer beware. Like if your kid dies, I guess you don't buy from that guy again. I mean, that was the only control that was in place. And yet Cleveland had vetoed the New York state legislation on grounds that were related to due process. Okay, so he vetoed that legislation that this pamphlet talks about because he said, why would we hold retailers financially responsible for bad food when the badness was done at the wholesale level, right? He says, you're attacking the wrong person. He seems to have been a little tone deaf in terms of not really understanding how widespread was this anxiety, especially because as much as Sandy talks about, yeah, you see this as a mother and you're like, what do you mean the milk is no good? this was also in really what we think of as the age of the child, in which children's safety was starting to become a matter of really special concern. Reform movements to eliminate child labor and to require school attendance. This is the age in which those things really have a lot of power behind them. What nobody really knew at the time, although some people probably suspected, was that this is really the beginning. The things that were done in order to protect children turned out to be the beginning of a much larger safety net to protect many more people. But the fear of impure food was able to take root both because it hit Americans in a really vulnerable position. It was true, they had no idea who made their food and how. And there was minimal industrial or agricultural regulation. And because it resonated with a second kind of language that was in the air. And this is where it gets really interesting. And this is where the slide that I prematurely called for earlier comes into play. Okay, so Americans were wondering, what if, in fact, their food was poisoned? Okay, so let's take a look at this particular slide. Okay, so Sandy, what stands out here?
What stands out here is, well, but first is the woman who is jumping off the bridge here. For some reason, my eyes go to that first. That the liquor has been adulterated. There's, clearly some poverty, and that liquor is causing all of the badness in this image.
Right. And the language underneath is being very specific, right? That's talking about adulterated liquor or adulterated wine. But they're meant to be truly horrifying scenes, right? And adulterated liquor was a thing. When there were, tests, by the time that such tests could be done, it seemed like about a quarter of wine bottles contained salicylic acid, which bottlers were using as a preservative. But what's really interesting is the way that this amplifies the temperance movement and its attempts to really politicize Americans' concerns that they were being poisoned by strangers, which is really what this comes down to. So if we think of many of the safeguards that we have now, none of which existed. So this is things like labeling requirements, safety testing, factory inspections, guidelines for what is food and what is merely something you can put into your stomach. There was no Food or Drug Administration or federal legislation until the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. And that act only prohibited the interstate commerce of adulterated foods, right? So you could do it in your state, just not, sending them then out of state. Yeah. So over the course of the next 40 years, the WCTU in particular, which was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and was perhaps the nation's most important and most powerful women's lobbying group with hundreds of thousands of members, would argue for two political aims that would address this sort of problem and fuse it to their overall concerns about temperance. So one is scientific temperance instruction in schools, and the other is prohibition for everybody. And they did so on the grounds that alcohol was inherently poisonous. So not just that it could be adulterated, but that alcohol was in and of itself a poison, and that Americans needed political institutions to protect them from this poison. Okay, and here I think we have some text to look at, right?
Yes, we do.
Sandy, do you want to read some of the relevant sentences here?
I am going to read it for you. I'll read the two paragraphs that are here and not the headpiece here. Okay. So the cause of temperance will ever be a fluctuating reform until it is based on the education of the people as to the proven facts and deductions of science, namely, that the nature and effects of alcoholic drinks and other narcotics are poisonous to the human system, and as such, should be abolished from personal habits and unlawful traffic. Therefore, early education in the whole through the schools, of every child in the Republic as to the real nature and effects of alcoholic drinks and other narcotics is the object of this department, which was created in 1880 with its aims then only untried ideas.
Right. Okay, so what in here seems interesting? Is there like a phrase that stands out to you at all? I hope I haven't contaminated you too much by talking about this already.
No. And I've been thinking about it a lot. I think the fact that they are relating, first of all, alcohol to other narcotics that are poisonous to the human system, and that they want to start educating children as young as possible as to the evil effects, because prohibition has been around for this point. And this is where the historian comes in. Have they been talking about it in schools so much before this point?
So not so much, except in as far as if you lived in a community that used the Bible as a reading textbook in school, so which wasn't uncommon, right? There was an interpretation of the story of Noah, right, that really emphasized the idea that alcohol was inherently bad. And so to a certain extent, they got it there. But this was something different in that it was about arguing for a scientific, not a religious, but a scientific presence in the classroom. And what the Women's Christian Temperance Union does is they pass legislation in state after state that requires students to be taught that alcohol is a poison. And they make textbooks and they do all sorts of different things in order to make sure that this spreads as widely as possible. So the name of the author down there at the bottom, Mary H. Hunt, if you're interested in this, will pop up everywhere, right? So she's the superintendent of a WCTU department, not of a school system or something like that, but she winds up being massively connected to lots of people all over the country. So this is not a small movement. This is the beginning of American drug education.
Hey, Lisa, can I stop and ask you a question here? So it's interesting that they're using scientific, like how, and this is about the era where they're really starting to hone in on science and germs, if I'm not mistaken. So how important is it that they're using science as a basis here?
So part of it is that they're trying to bolster what already is religious authority with scientific authority. But part of it is also that there is about to be an explosion in American public education that is about to look a lot more like what we think of public education looking, with people continuing for more grades, with more schools being built and things like that. And so by arguing that this is science, they secure for it a place in the curriculum that it wouldn't necessarily have if they had called it something else.
Okay.
Also, they really believe that this is scientific truth, that alcohol is a poison. And that use of the term poison is something that they insist upon, right? Like for them, it is not alcohol education the way that they're imagining it. If the rule is don't drink too much, right? They want to argue that any drop of alcohol consumed is inherently poisonous because it hurts you from the very, very first drop. And for them, you know, the science itself is not good. Like there's a whole bunch of circulating ideas that are Mendelian about how if you conceive a child while you're drunk, that therefore the child will necessarily, be drunk in the womb. And like it's a very odd sort of combination of ways that they're trying to figure it out. But it's that poison language is the part that they really want to hone in on. That's really, really important to them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So basically it would be really bad if that was true, right? If alcohol was not just poisoned, but inherently poisonous. So late 19th century Americans drank a lot. And when I say a lot, I mean, it's more than now. The average American over age 15, so I'm talking about a lower age too, over age 15 consumed 1.5 gallons of pure alcohol per year. Now that sounds like a lot, but then you figure that, especially at this historical moment, women consumed far less than men did. So consumption of alcohol was gendered as a masculine activity. So women tended to like take sips from patent medicines. That was really common. Or like a small glass at the end of the day for medicinal purposes, versus men, it would be drinking during the workday, like fairly continually. So really, when we think about it, it means that adult men were generally probably drinking 2.5 to 3 gallons of pure alcohol per year. And this is a lot more than now. And it's also really concerning because of the unique responsibilities men had, namely nominating decent candidates for office was almost exclusively a male activity. Women did, in fact, have suffrage in some states in the American West, but it wasn't yet pervasive. So the other thing is that most of the drinking that men didn't take place at home. It was overwhelmingly done in saloons. And saloons were, I mean, I got to be honest, pretty vile spaces. They had the status as male-only refuges. They were closed to the street by curtains. And the curtains generally hid that in a saloon, you had a lot of dirty paintings, you had prostitution, you had gambling. And of course, as I mentioned before, that's where elections are held. So when we say elections are held in saloons, I mean, that's not a great environment. And it's not the same as now when I go to my children's elementary school to vote and you have this wholesome feeling of like, let's do it for the kids. That's very different than the idea of going into a saloon and just drinking until you vote and then drinking after you vote. So for the WCTU and for many other reformers in this era, they really started to really like hold on tight to this language where the goal was to avoid poison and to exalt purity. And those are two really, really important politically Latin words, poison and purity. Okay, and so when Sandy and I started talking about this, she told me about a couple other things that are part of the GLI collection. And I think you were going to show a couple of cartoons, right?
Yeah. And so this is one of our favorites that we found just the other day, which shows the candy as being poisonous. And this is in Puck magazine. Puck was one of the first successful humor magazines in the United States. Originally started in 1876 by Joseph Kepler in German and switched to English in 1877. It was 16 pages and cost 10 cents, which I think is interesting. But the image itself is really interesting because you have a doctor and a sexton or a member of the clergy with a candy, a giant candy in between them. And all of these things are different types of poison or additives that were not healthy. And in the background, you have some poor children looking in the windows of a candy shop. But in the middle here are some more well-dressed people. And of course, the doctor's hiding a couple of bottles in his coat. And this just seems like dubious. Like, hey, I don't know. And maybe it's a modern thing. And you can tell me, Lisa, if somebody has hiding bottles in their coat, it's probably
that's
not
ever been a good thing.
it's probably not a great thing. But the idea is that all of these additives are what's in candy. And I think the team had a question about arsenic. And so is arsenic a poison? And why was it in the candy?
Well,
So obviously arsenic's a poison.
Yeah, I mean, like in trace amounts, it's probably not that bad. But in the biologist can correct me. I'm sure there's some biologists watching. But here it's that idea that it's hitting enough of a level that it's really interfering. So arsenic is ranked, if you notice, like adjacent to a food coloring product or lead, so its neighbors are not good. And intriguingly, the one at the bottom is glucose, right? Which the big concern there was simply that it wasn't what it pretended to be. But I love the title of this particular piece too, right? Which is secretly poisoned candy, right? So what you think you're eating is probably bad enough. It's going to be sugar and some fruit flavorings and peppermint or something like that. But that in fact, it's even worse because it contains chalk. It contains red lead. It contains arsenic, all of these other things that one would generally prefer not to have in their already not so good for you food.
I can't tell if they're tipping their hats at each other or at the giant candy stick. It's a very strange thing here.
Yeah, no, I can't tell either. It would be customary in a lot of political cartoons to show people bowed down or somehow, saluting what they considered the thing that they conformed to, right? That they followed. And here it's suggesting that the doctor and the sexton are not only aware, but they're complicit, right? So they're not hoodwinked. They're well aware and they're kind of okay with the fact they're permitting these things to circulate.
Yeah. And I different topic a little bit, but we have a lot of vintage newspapers, and one of them advertised arsenic as a cure for morning sickness during pregnancy. And we thought that was a little odd.
Yeah, it's probably not a good idea.
So Allison popped up, so that means we have a question.
I have a quick question that I found really funny, and I want to give kudos to the question asker, Susan. Susan asks, do you think we would see a greater voter turnout if we had held elections in saloons today?
Yes.
What do you both think?
I do. So I think, as all things, it comes down to the question, but does that make it a good idea? The progressive era is really an attempt to simultaneously keep politics popular and make it rational. And I would say that it makes sense to me that those two things are actually in tension with each other. So
maybe we should hold them in the mall. The mall always has a lot of people in it.
Might bring the malls back.
Maybe.
That's true.
Right.
So if you think about like student council elections, lots of times there's like candy in exchange for voting, right? And is it really crazy to imagine that if you had to miss, a shift at work in order to show up at the polls, that there should be some kind of compensation for that? It's not insane, right? It also just sounds like bribery. So it's a little tricky. Yeah, maybe amusement parks, you get in free for the day if you vote. And of course, there's the flip side, right? There's plenty of nations where if you don't vote, you actually have to pay an extra tax.
Mm.
So there's a punitive possibility there too.
Couple more
Sorry,
questions.
Susan.
Couple more questions about this cartoon specifically. There's one from Robert, and Robert wants to know if Kepler's cartoon refers to a specific incident that actually happened. And then second question is from Lauren, and Lauren says, I'm confused as to what exactly is glucose, and isn't it found in foods today? How is it poisonous?
Yeah, so I can answer the second one, but not the first. So glucose was not necessarily considered a horror in and of itself, right? It was, if you think of now how upset people get when they find out that there's extra sugar added to applesauce, right? It felt like a betrayal of what you thought you were getting. So many times it was a substitute for things that people thought they were purchasing, such as honey, rather than being seen as always on the level of arsenic, is what I would say. Sandy, did you have a take on the periodical itself? I don't know if this responds to a specific incident.
I don't know either, but we can go through, and by Monday morning, we'll go through the, and actually, if Madison's in tomorrow, maybe Madison will go through the scans that we have and see if there's anything that tells us what it's about. In Harper's Weekly, which I'm more familiar with than Puck, the engravings always have a story that goes with them that tells what it's illustrating. I'm not sure if Puck does that because they're more of a humor magazine. And so a lot of their illustrations are intended to be the subject, right? So you're supposed to look at this and just get what it's talking about. But we can definitely double check.
I love that question because it's a great historical question, right?
Exactly.
We started off by saying like most historical research starts with, what's that thing about?
Absolutely.
And that's exactly the kind of question that just got asked.
And one more quick thing that I want to point out that was observed by one of our guests, Harriet, that there are two different groups of children in the background going into the confectionery. Some are a little bit better dressed than others, and then on the far left, there are also people who are not dressed as well as the children in the fluffy hat and the bows and everything. So this is something that we love. We love when all kinds of observations are made and inferences about things that we don't know, but we do all the time with our students that come to the collection for visits. So love all the observations.
Well, and we know that class has something to do with the way people are experiencing this because of that language from the very cover of the pamphlet, right? Which said like that Grover Cleveland was betraying the poor by not doing this. It does seem like the poor are more likely to have products that are spoiled or are adulterated because well-preserved foods were easier to buy around the year, right? They didn't have a seasonal cost attached to them. And in fact, that explains why, decades later, more attempts to purify milk actually have a significant point of resistance from people who don't have very much money, because they complain that basically the extra work to make sure that the cows are not having any diseases actually drives up the cost of their milk. And they said, we'd rather run the risk and have the milk be in our price range. So class matters. With something like candy, it's interesting, that choice, right? Because here, clearly part of what's trying to get in there is the idea that whoever you are, you love your children. And, and trying to tell people who have money, like, don't think you can protect your children from this. Anytime anybody's child is at risk, your child is also at risk. So there's a real attempt to kind of reach out across that class divide, which is different. Yeah.
I also think it's interesting because the pamphlet in particular, in talking about children, it's throughout the pamphlet, but it's aimed at men because only men could vote in the state where this was published. And we'll tell you about that in a second. But so it's definitely appealing to the father's protective nature over their children.
I mean, there were a lot of women who felt like they were able to influence husbands or influence sons. But yeah, I mean, either you can vote or you can't, right? And that was definitely a division there. Yeah. And if you notice, a lot of the people who I see as vote influencers, right? Like the WCTU, some of the most effective lobbyists. That's all women who are basically upset because they can't vote and trying to find other ways to get to the people who can. Yeah. I think we had another cartoon to look at too. So this one's about poison, but you also found one about purity, right?
Yeah. And this one's not a cartoon, but an advertisement. And we actually got it from the Boston Public Library because it was just so perfect. And it's Heinz advertising their altogether pure food and all of the different kinds of products that they have. And part of this was interesting to me because I had just seen a docudrama, I think is the best way to say it. And I forget what channel it's on, but I think it's Food That Made America. And they did one on Heinz, which is fascinating, but also gross because they do get into what exactly was wrong with food during the time period. But Heinz is saying, look, I have all this pure food for you.
And of course, part of it is, remember I was talking about how there's that transition from just having generic food that's sold in bulk to the kind of ascendancy of these name brand products, right? Which aren't available everywhere, but are increasingly available. It's clearly moving in that direction. So when Heinz is really trying to build its brand, although it wouldn't have used that language at the time, this idea of pure food, they know is going to be something that the public is going to respond to. Right? The idea that like, no, our prepackaged food is actually more pure than the stuff that you might buy locally. Not sure I buy it, but they were really trying to pitch that way to the public. So right. I think part of this is really just going back to and really doubling down on what is the discourse, what's the language of the day that people are using to talk about goodness and badness, right? In really generic sorts of terms. So purity, whether it's pickles or whatever, is really being seen as inherently good, even in ways that we might have serious questions about. Like I've looked at a lot of interviews for pure lead in paint, right? Or pure tobacco, because it's free of sawdust, right? So purity was kind of the organic of its day, and that the term itself tended to cover everything around it and make it seem healthier or better or more established. So if you want to know kind of what the scale of this language of purity and poison really is, you can do something like I did, which is I went through the historical New York Times, which some of you might have a subscription to, and is an amazing search engine. And you can actually find out how often a word pops up in the newspaper. So I looked through to find out how many newspaper articles in 1884 in the New York Times used the term pure. And it was 1,588, like a lot. And poison wasn't quite as common, but still 473 times, right? And so to think about this is like this language of poison and purity is just all over. And most tellingly for us, for going back to the election of 1884 and this strange pamphlet that Sandy located, is the way in which the social purity movement was really being propelled by a combination of physicians and reformers. Now, at this point, any normal person would say, what is social purity, right? So it was a language that was really common at the time, but now isn't as well known. So social purity was about how the constituency of respectable, reform-minded Northern Republicans described their attempts to abolish prostitution and to end sexually transmitted infections that were part of sex work, right? So this language of social purity was attached in a really meaningful way to these worlds of talking about food and talking about food and drink, right? And how these all work together. Okay, so given the fear that sex work could spread, we get now to the next cartoon. So this might be instantly recognizable. It was in my US history textbook in high school. Sandy, did you have this in your textbook? Do you remember?
I don't remember. We sort of glossed over this era in history altogether. We just didn't cover it very much.
Greatest fear. People, they get nervous about teaching the Gilded Age and Progressive era because it doesn't really follow linearly, right? Like it matters. If you talk about 1884, it really matters where in the country you're talking about. And so sometimes, 1884 in Chicago and 1884 in rural Illinois are not the same thing, right? At all. And it's certainly not the same as between Chicago and Atlanta. I mean, that's not the same thing. It's really proceeding really differently in different ways. But here, this is a really very popular cartoon. If you Google Grover Cleveland, I would bet that this comes up pretty quick after all of the portraits. And basically, we have the tie line of Grover the Good, and we can see that Grover is plugging his ears against a baby who's saying, "I want my paw." Okay, so this is going to require a little bit of explanation. So respectable people, like the maker of the pamphlet is trying to be, we're looking for a way to explain why Grover Cleveland, the Democratic candidate, who had a remarkably, I'm going to use the word pure record as an appointed and elected official, was in fact unfit for office. And there was one disqualifying fact about Cleveland that would indeed turn many Gilded Age voters against him. And that was the fact that Cleveland had had a child out of wedlock. Okay, so when we look at the image, how is that getting conveyed in this image, Sandy? What do you see?
The baby trying to get to him, but also that baby kind of looks like Grover Cleveland.
It does. I mean, like all babies look like grumpy old men, but this one in particular seems to be going that way, right? And the woman holding him, or holding the baby, right, is obviously in distress, right? So, okay, so what's about the woman's appearance or posture or attire that signals distress?
Well, that she's crying and she's covering her face.
Right. So, and that face cover suggests like a shame, right? Mm-hmm. So there's something about it in there. Okay, so Cleveland had been completely and totally open about his refusal to marry the mother of his child. Now, in the late 19th century, such behavior, not the child having, which wasn't that unusual, but the refusing to get married and the admitting, that was really unorthodox. Usually an unplanned pregnancy was quickly followed by marriage. But Cleveland claimed that, or he let others claim, that Maria Crofts Halpin had in fact been a courtesan. Okay, so you got to love the double standard here. I mean, that's clearly coming into play. So without marriage as an option, Halpin had, after giving birth to a son who had the surname Cleveland, placed the son up for adoption and had been admitted to a mental institution, or in some tellings, a sanatorium, which would be something like a rehab center now. So, and it seems worth noting that privately, the story seems to have been even darker, that Halpin kind of, in some cases, seems to refer to Cleveland as more along the lines of a rapist and a kidnapper, right? So the best case scenario is still pretty not great, and the worst case scenario is really devastating. But the problem is that the campaign, that group of Republicans, they didn't feel like they could be respectable people and still talk about Cleveland's actions, right? Because the talking about it was inherently seen as contaminating. There's also a lot of cultural reasons about this related to gender, and that the Republican Party had a lot of very dedicated women reformers behind them. And this was not really something to talk about in front of ladies. So like, this is from Puck, right? This cartoon?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. And so when we get this, like the idea is that really even reading cultures are fairly gendered at this moment. And so humor magazines would have been purchased overwhelmingly by boys and men, not by girls and women. And so the idea was that that was a location where this could get discussed a little more, but it wasn't really seen as appropriate to discuss in front of larger groups. You had to be really discreet about this. There's also a legal reason why it's really hard to talk about Cleveland as somebody who had seemingly explained the fact that he had a child out of wedlock by accusing the mother of being a courtesan. Why that was something that Republicans couldn't spin and talk about. And that's related to the Comstock statutes. So from 1873 onward, there is federal legislation that bans discussion of sexuality from the males. This is really a problem for like physicians are like, why did all my copies of anatomy guides get taken by the post office? So the thing is, to actually discuss this in print would put someone at risk of arrest, right? So in this world, the Republicans are really frustrated because their best piece of ammunition against Cleveland is one that they can't use, right? And they're really trying to figure it out how it works. Okay, so this begs the question, how can you talk about someone committing adultery without mentioning sex, given that mentioning sex is both kind of illicit and illegal when done in print? And as a historian, here's my claim. I argue this. You talk about adulterated food, which is, of course, immediately where Sandy's mind had gone at the very beginning, right? Yep. So my take is that this campaign was invigorated heavily by rumors and whispers, and Republican Party leaders wanted to really round up Republicans who were threatening, in particular, to either stay at home and not vote for Blaine, right? Or even to go over to Cleveland. And they wanted to make sure to keep the ranks of Republicans really close to the party. And it was really about picking off just a few voters here and there. They didn't need to persuade everybody, but just to kind of keep enough within the Republican Party. Remember that politically, this is an era in which people did vote for the same party every single time, a straight party ticket, an election after election. But it was just beginning to give way to independent voters. And so that's really the current. So the pamphlet didn't need to be good. It just needed to be good enough. So strategies such as this piece of propaganda were therefore really about getting lapsing Republicans to stick with the party. And it was necessary because the Republican candidate was pretty bad too. So I think we have kind of a side-by-side feature of the two party candidates. Oh, Lordy. Okay, so Republican James Blaine, his campaign had been damaged by accusations that were, in all fairness, probably correct, that he had leveraged his office as Speaker of the House for personal financial gain, that he had routinely taken money from corporations and anybody who wanted a job. And to be clear, this was ethically very bad. Okay, so Blaine had also found it impossible to shake gossip about his family life. He and his wife had been married 2 times in 2 different states, which was weird and perhaps suggested something was not quite right. And there were rumors he couldn't shake that he himself had originally resulted in a baby before he and his wife got married. So Cleveland's personal virtue was kind of in the gutter, but he had a much cleaner, a much purer public record than Blaine. As mayor of Buffalo and the governor of New York, Cleveland had vetoed expenditures on legislation that wasn't in the public interest. He had a reputation as an advocate for civil service reform. Civil services reform at the time basically meant that government jobs went to people who scored the highest on tests, which sounds kind of arbitrary until you realize that the alternative was just whoever won office gave all the jobs to his nephews, right? So it was seen as really a better way to do things. So, I mean, there you have it. So why did the makers of this pamphlet have reason to believe that Cleveland's veto on food safety legislation might horrify Americans to such an extent that they would vote for Blaine? Okay, the pamphlet's author is relying upon the idea that the audience was already primed, that the audience was already prepared to think of food, sex, partisanship, and alcohol as interchangeable measures of virtue. Okay, and by this standard, Cleveland, the food adulterator, was inferior. So if you understand the worldview of Republican voters at this moment, it also helps us do fun tricks like recognizing sarcasm. Which is arguably a task that is as difficult as trying to explain a joke. So let's look at the last page of the pamphlet so you can see, if it's not sarcasm, I'm not sure what the literary trope would be, but you'll be in on it. Okay, so the last page is an endorsement of Cleveland, which is meant as a damaging endorsement from the grave diggers union in Necropolis, who are saying, we're so glad, we love Grover Cleveland because he's going to create all sorts of new business for us, right? Grave diggers union in Necropolis. I mean, like, but you look at it and all of a sudden you realize that the topness of this, right, is really what they're trying to get at, right? The sense of like, oh God, Cleveland is awful too, is really all that the pamphlet's authors need for Republican voters who usually vote Republican to kind of buy into. And that's what they're going for. So I think I've made a pretty compelling historical argument about what this is about. But at the same time, like Sandy and I were talking, there's still some details that are a little fuzzy, right?
Yep.
So I think we had another slide that helped us answer some questions, but not terribly well. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we found and where you came up with this other piece of paper?
Yep. So this letter accompanied the pamphlet. So they came together. That's why when you look at our numbers, one is a 0.01, the other's a 0.02. And it's from J.S. Goldsmith. And he appears to be the person who created the pamphlet. And this is him writing to Samuel Fessenden, who is a secretary of the Republican National Committee in New York, asking for compensation, whatever you think is fair, which I think is a little weird, for the cartoon. I find it really interesting. And he has a couple of other things here, like the Factory Children's Bill, something's 5 cents. But if you notice, like this date here is October 9th, 1884. And when you come back here, he dated the Gravediggers endorsement as, October 1st, 1884. So he sent this like right after he made it to the Republican National Committee asking for some compensation. I don't know if he got it, but he tried to.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? Because we don't know if he was hired to do this particular work, if he just volunteered for it, if he's responsible for the whole pamphlet, if he published the pamphlet, if he kind of pieced this together with his friends. But he clearly has some expectation that it will be pleasing. But then the other tricky thing is, of course, it's written on the letterhead of the Republican National Committee, which would suggest that the person submitting it, Goldsmith, had this letterhead somehow in order to be able to send it to a person whose name is on the letterhead.
Yeah.
So that's where it gets really confusing, right?
Yeah. And like I had, maybe he printed the letterhead for them. Maybe he helped create it. I don't know. It's an interesting question. And we did try to look Goldsmith up and we found very little, right, Lisa?
Yeah, just there was that he had been involved as a witness, that he was he was pressing a lawsuit and his own attorney got into a fight with a member of the jury. And it was just like a couple paragraphs, right, in a newspaper article. But I think it's good and fair for us to show and to share with people what it's like when you kind of hit the end of the line. You're like, there I give up. It would take me hours more to figure out anything else. So,
or you write a thesis about it.
Yeah, or you can write a thesis about it. So I want to make sure that I talk a little bit about the election outcome, but I see Allison is back. And I know that my blurb about the election outcome only takes 3 minutes. So if you want to ask a question, now's probably a good time.
Great. Yeah, there are a couple, and a lot of them are pretty similar. So it's great that, the audience they're kind of similar questions here. One that's being asked quite a bit, but I will pull the random name. Stephanie as one of our question askers here and wants to know. So saying pure, using the word pure, was used to trick people into buying food products. Was that was like tricking
people? Would we say people using organic as a way to trick people into buying products?
That's a really good point. It's like, what does it actually mean?
Yeah, I think it's an ill-defined word, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a word that expresses values, not content, is the way that I would describe it. And so that's what makes it kind of fun. It's a multi-purpose word. Because if you think about it, anything that applies, Sandy, I'm going to go there, both to pickles and to avoiding prostitution, is a word that is really nimble, right?
Yeah, there you go. The next question, actually, I'm going to give a shout out, comes from my dad, Mike. Hi, Dad. Tuning in this evening. And he's asking if Cleveland's campaign specifically addressed these accusations of food purity in the campaign. And if so, how? How did they address those claims?
The way he winds up addressing it is by winning. And then Cleveland is kind of actually a breakthrough in terms of food safety. So in 1886, you get the Butter Act, which is really one of the first things that I know of that is about accuracy and labeling. And it's really pushed by the dairy industry, right? Because they get really frustrated about oleomargarine, or what we would now call margarine, which is packaging itself as butter. And in fact, because margarine can be made out of any kind of fat product. And what they would do is they would create it out of the fat product, and sometimes other things fell in. And then they would dye it yellow so it looked like butter. And so Cleveland really kind of takes that up and actually has a pretty good record on the issue of advancing food purity. The Department of Education or of Agriculture winds up being the area where, before you get the FDA, a lot of this activity to try and actually create regulations takes place.
I have one more quick question before we go on to the final slide. Sari wants to know if temperance organizations and other food purity activists, if they were trying to influence local, state, or national governments with their publications.
Oh, well, now I feel like I should just go to the election outcome, because this is where it gets fun from my point of view. Okay, so I'm going to explain this cartoon, which otherwise makes no sense whatsoever. You have to know the guy on the ground is Blaine. Okay, that's the first thing you have to know. Why he is presented always with feathers in his hat, I do not actually know. I'm going to be honest, but it is part of his iconography, right? So some of the generally Republican voters who decided that they couldn't vote either for Cleveland or for Blaine wound up voting for a third party candidate. And that's the guy who's dumping the bucket of water. And his name, I have asked everyone and cannot figure out how to pronounce. It is either John St. John or John St. John. Okay, so who's this guy, this third party candidate for the presidency? Well, he's somebody who actually does have a pure personal reputation and a pure political reputation. He's the former governor of Kansas, and he's running with the Prohibition Party. Because it all comes back. So he gets a whole bunch of votes from people who just really hate Cleveland and Blaine. But there's also a huge group of people who really want to vote for Prohibition because they think it'll incredibly improve the American polity. So St. John winds up getting about 150,000 votes around the country, which is, impressive. Like, that's not nothing at this historical moment. But as we know, not all states, when it comes to the vote, are equally important. And in 1884, it turned out that the swingingest swing state was New York, where the Prohibition Party candidate, John St. John, gets 25,000 votes. And the margin of difference between Cleveland and Blaine is 1,000. So those people who decided to vote for St. John, most of whom would have otherwise voted Republican, right? Wound up making it possible for Cleveland to win the state and hence the presidency. That's where this really comes. So Cleveland's ensuing victory is depicted here because it's John St. John pouring cold water, the cold water of Prohibition instead of wine, on Blaine's campaign and his election. And as a result, Blaine doesn't win. So angry Republicans from around the country, I'm going to use a really technical term, they freaked out when Cleveland won. I mean, they just lost their minds. And they really blamed St. John, and they blamed the Prohibition Party, this third party about temperance, for everything that happened. And when I say they lost their mind, I mean, there was a riot at Oberlin. Like, that's not a place you think of riots really happening. They burned St. John in effigy in Topeka. They threw eggs at Prohibition Party voters. They vandalized houses. They boycotted businesses. And they even fired members of the Prohibition Party who were employees. The violence was so widespread, and this is an old time quote, so it's okay to say, that the Washington Post at the time would describe effigy burners as, quote, making prodigious asses of themselves. So basically, purity was an incredibly powerful discourse. And at this point, it still hadn't hit its peak. So if we go way back to the New York Times, you can count how many times a word gets used in any given year. The high point is actually in the 1920s. So it's going to go up and up and up until the era that is the Prohibition era, and that is its peak. So arguably, it's the Prohibitionists who win this whole thing, or at least get the last laugh, especially because Cleveland loses in 1888. So that was a long way around of answering that question. So it's going to be a steady chipping for the people who are concerned about food purity and the people who are concerned about alcohol consumption. And they're just going to, little bit by little bit, make their play.
Yeah. So I don't know if when you zoom this out, it's not terribly noticeable. And one of the great things about working with documents and like really searching primary sources, if you zoom in on things, there's like a bunch of people here in the background. Can you see that? There's a person, here's a guy in a hat and a little kid. I don't know why they're there. They're just watching. I don't know who they are, but
maybe they're burning an
Thomas
effigy.
Nast. Maybe it's Thomas Nast. So like he put them in there.
Yeah. And I
So
mean,
it's kinda
you
cool.
can also see how beautiful this illustration is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like the cross hatching there. I mean, like, I feel like we should bring this back to the office and have Sarah take a look at it. We have some people who have a great visual arts background around.
Yeah.
But it's a beautiful illustration of, a political moment.
Yeah. And this kind of like cross hatching is usually indicative of like a steel plate engraving because you can't do it on some of the earlier types.
Oh, neat.
You
I didn't
get
know
that fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can even see where the crease of the body happens. I mean, it's really beautiful. Yeah.
All right. And so are there any other questions, Allison? We could take one more.
Oh, there are so many to choose from. Okay, I will choose this one that's in front of me from Allison, actually. And Allison wants to know, do you think there were people who were not necessarily anti-alcohol who voted for prohibition parties because of issues like food purity instead?
I think there's a pretty good chance of that, because the people who were pro-temperance, even if they weren't sure about prohibition, but pro-temperance, the people who were food purity people, the people who frankly wanted kindergartens, who liked public parks, who thought that government programs should pick up the trash. In other words, I'm going to be honest here, us, like, people who like city services, those people were Republican voters. So in the same way that, when we look at the early Republican Party, it's really this combination of people who come out of abolitionism, right? And the temperance movement. Those are the two movements that are really clear constituencies of voters among Republicans from the beginning. And it's only when the temperance people, a certain element of them, get sick of the Republican Party not listening to them, that they decide to strike it out on their own and form a new political party. Yeah. Plus, sometimes people vote for third parties just as a way to kind of show their anger. That it's not that they were lazy; it's just that they hated the candidates. Spite.
It's always been a pet peeve of mine, and this is going back like decades and decades. So it's not nothing new, nothing historical. People who think that politics prior to the age that you're alive in was more pure than it is today, and I've heard this my entire adult life. It was always dirty, always mudslinging. There was always some sort of drama and controversy going on, and sometimes they were better at it than we are. But it's what makes history fun, like studying past political elections and seeing the digs they took at each other.
Well, and also I think we can look at it as a series of accomplishments, right? While I wish that we had 80% of people voting now, like there's nothing I would like better than that. I am also kind of glad that we don't bribe people for their votes. I'm glad nobody watches me deposit my ballot, right? Like, so there's things that, we lose some and we get some when these kinds of changes happen, but I will quite confidently put milk in my coffee tomorrow and feel really good about it in a way that I couldn't have done in 1884. So in other words, I do think now is better in a lot of ways. The only thing is I wish we could raise that voter turnout.
Yeah. And before I turn it over to Allison, I think it's a good place to mention that we have a voting rights project that is going to be coming out is it April or May, Lisa?
I'm not quite sure, actually. Spring. Use the term spring.
Yep. Spring of 2023. I was going to say 24, but 2023. It'll include a traveling exhibition, which is grant funded to come to your school or historical organization, as well as a plethora of other activities. So stay tuned for some more information. And Allison, do you want to talk to us about some upcoming programs?
Sure. So stay tuned for information about our upcoming Inside the Ball taking place April 6th at 7 p.m. Always the first Thursday of the month, but keep your eyes and your ears open for more information about that. But before that, Book Breaks takes place this Sunday, March 5th at 2 p.m., where Samantha Seeley is joining our wonderful Book Breaks team, talking about her book, Race Removal and the Right to Remain, Migration and Making of the United States. Should be an absolutely fantastic conversation. And then information about the Gettysburg College Gilder Lehrman MA in American History. Applications are now open for the summer semester. They're on a rolling basis, but you can apply anytime. Registration begins March 18th, and the semester runs June 1st to August 23rd. If you are a K-12 educator and you are not yet enrolled in the MA program, there is an open house for you on Monday, March 13th at 8 p.m. Eastern. They'll be going over the courses, how to participate, the registration process, all of that information. So you will not want to miss that. And Madison is putting information about all of these things in the Q&A or in the chat for you. So click on all of those links to follow for more information. The slide presentation that you saw this evening, the program recording, and all of the links and the resources are going to be sent to you in an email tomorrow early afternoon if you're on the East Coast. You'll get it in the morning if you're on the West Coast. And if you're somewhere else in the world, you'll get it. It'll have all the information that you need. And if you're not receiving our emails, it's very possible that our email is being blocked. It happens quite a bit if you are a teacher using a school email. Your server could be blocking ours. So try a different email address. reach out to us at collectionprograms@gilderlehrman.org, and we will be happy to send you all the information that you need.
Absolutely. And so with that, I want to say thank you, Lisa, for joining us tonight. It's really fascinating look at a period I think that does get skipped over a lot and sort of discounted. And Cleveland is one of those, I guess he was a president kind of middle there. So thank you very much for that. And Allison, thank you as always. And Lisa, do you have any closing comments?
Read.
Read everything. Everything.
Read it all.
All right. Excellent. Allison, it's great working with you as always. And
Likewise.
have a great night.
Bye, everybody.